No, those aren't huts burning. That's my youth on fire. Girls resembling boys march through the war. This frequently cited poem by Yulia Dunina captures the oft-forgotten blurring of traditional gender roles that occurred during the Second World War, when Soviet women like Drunina herself armed themselves in defense of the motherland and donned soldiers' overcoats symbolic of the military roles they performed. Like many veterans who fought in World War II, the war defined Drunina's youth and would remain a theme in her poetry long after her service concluded. Drunina's tendency to focus on the young woman's experience in war carves out a specific, unique place for her work within the canon of war literature. Over the course of a half century, Yulia Drunina wrote autobiographical poems featuring a rich variety of themes on love, her family, Russian history, but most extensively she wrote about her wartime experience. Drunina was born into a multilingual teacher's family in Moscow on May 10, 1924. Her father was a history teacher and her mother worked in a library and gave music lessons. From her early childhood, she loved to read and was clear in her mind that she would be a writer someday. Yulia started writing poetry when she was 11 and composed her first poem, We Sat Together at a School Desk. This poem won her a contest and was later published in the Uchichelskaya Gazeta, that is, teacher's newspaper, and then broadcast on the radio. Although her father himself was a poet, he did not encourage her to follow the literary vocation. Yulia recalled, and I never doubted that I would be a writer. I could not be shaken either by serious arguments or by the ridicule of my father, who was trying to save his daughter from cruel disappointments. He knew that only a few made their way to Parnassus. Why should I be among them? Unfortunately, her father did not live to see Yulia's real literary success, and she lamented about this all her life. After all, she was her father's daughter. She idolized him. After the USSR was attacked by Germany in June 1941, 17-year-old Yulia joined the Regional Red Cross Society, trained as a nurse, and began volunteering at a local hospital. It was a difficult time, not only because she had to do long hours of work without much rest, but also because of the terrible memories which stayed with her. Memories of continuous and deafening airstrikes that shook the walls of the institution every hour, and losses of numerous lives. Later that summer, as the German army approached Moscow, she was dispatched along with a group of nurses to help build fortifications near Mozhaisk, about 100 kilometers to the west of the capital. On the way, the group got caught in an airstrike in which half of the girls got killed. Yulia received a mild concussion and was not able to reach her destination. She was exhausted and hungry. Fortunately, she was picked up by a group of infantrymen who needed a combat medic. This group later found itself encircled by the enemy and spent 13 days breaking out through occupied territory. During those 13 days, Yulia fell in love with the battalion commander and described him in several poems written throughout her life by referring to him simply as Commander. The commander, along with several other infantrymen from the group, did not make it out of the encirclement, having been killed by a landmine explosion. Yulia returned to Moscow in the fall of 1941, but soon left for Siberia together with her father as part of the civilian evacuation. She did not want to leave Moscow and agreed to evacuate only because of her ailing father, who had suffered a stroke at the beginning of the war. After her father died in early 1942, Yulia went to Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East, where she enrolled in the school for aviation technicians. But wanting to fight on the front lines, she soon joined a rifle unit as a combat medic and was sent to the Belarusian front, where she served alongside Zinaida Samsonova, also a combat medic, who in 1944 died in combat and was posthumously awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union. She was only 19 years old. Drunina later wrote one of her most heartfelt poems, Zinka, about Samsonova. In 1943, Drunina was seriously injured when a shell fragment struck her in the neck several millimeters from her carotid artery. Unaware of the severity of her injury, she simply wrapped her neck in bandages and continued to work. Eventually, she was hospitalized in critical condition and was said to have barely survived. She wrote her first poems about the war while in the hospital. She wrote a long poem about breaking through the encirclement, but was unhappy with the result, cutting out everything except for this quatrain. It became the most anthologized of her poems. The quatrain reads, "Once I saw hand-to-hand combat, then I dreamt it a myriad more. Whoever says war is not frightening knows nothing at all about war." After recovering, she returned to Moscow, where she applied to the Maxim Gorky Literature Institute, but was denied admission, her writing having been deemed not mature enough. She then returned to the front and fought near Pskov and in the Baltic region. She was wounded again in 1944 November and spent the rest of the war in Moscow, where she again tried her luck at the Literature Institute, and this time was allowed to enroll as a war veteran. For her bravery in war, she was decorated with Order of the Red Star and Medal for Courage, among many other awards and medals. At the Literary Institute, end of 1944, she met her future husband, Nikolai Starshinov, also a war veteran and an aspiring poet. She gave birth to her only daughter, Yelena, in 1946. The family lived in a communal apartment in extreme poverty in post-war Moscow, while Yulia continued to write. In 1960, she divorced her first husband and married screenwriter Alexei Kaplev, whom she had met in 1954. Drunina and Kaplev remained happily married until Kaplev's death in 1979. Drunina devoted many of her poems to her husband. I have a recitation of one of her poems dedicated to her husband, Alexei Kaplev. Many of her poems have been set to music. So let's hear the recitation of the poem, followed by the song.
Ты рядом, и все прекрасно, и дождь, и холодный ветер. Спасибо тебе, мой ясный, за то, что ты есть на свете. Спасибо за эти губы, спасибо за руки эти, единственный мой. Спасибо за то, что ты есть на свете. Ты рядом, а ведь могли бы друг друга совсем не встретить. Спасибо тебе, мой любимый, за то, что ты есть на свете. Это тебе.
тебе, мой ясный, за то, что ты есть на свете. Спасибо за эти губы, спасибо за руки эти, спасибо тебе, мой любый, за то, что ты есть на свете. Ты рядом, а ведь могли бы друг друга совсем не встретить. Единственный мой спасибо за то, что ты есть на свете. Спасибо за эти губы, спасибо за руки эти, спасибо тебе, мой любый, за то, что ты есть на свете. Спасибо за эти губы, спасибо за руки эти, спасибо тебе, мой любый, за то, что ты есть на свете. Ты рядом, и все прекрасно.
The war that burst into Julia's youth left an indelible mark on her soul. She wrote many poems about the war years, filled with inexpressible grief, fear, constant hardship, and suffering. A specific moment when she transformed herself from a schoolgirl into a soldier remained the defining event in Drunina's life. In her poetry, she represents her generation's overnight transition from schoolgirls into militarized warriors as they left their childhoods behind by their own volition to enter the realm of war. I read out a poem in this context by the poet. By birth, I am not from childhood, I am from war, and therefore, probably, I value more than you can value the bliss of stillness as much as each new day I live. By birth, I am not from childhood, I am from war. Once on my way, through a gorilla, I firmly grasped that we must love all tender blades of grass. By birth, I am not from childhood, I am from war, and therefore possibly not well protected. Front soldiers' hearts are scorched, and your hands are rough. By birth, I am not from childhood, I am from war. Forgive me, therein no fault of mine. She joined the Writers' Union in 1947, which supported her financially and made it possible to continue her creative activities. 1948 saw the completion of her first book, a collection of poems called In a Soldier's Overcoat. Thereafter, in the years that followed, numerous poetry collections were published. Drunina uniquely was a woman soldier poet, and although she wrote about a variety of themes during her lifetime, she continued to write about her soldierly experience until her death. World War II was the defining moment in Drunina's life. Her service as a medic fundamentally shaped her sense of self, eclipsing motherhood and national acclaim for her literary work. In 1966, she wrote, "And there was nothing more beautiful, believe me, and in my life there was everything, than to defend a comrade from death and carry him from under fire." She continued until her death to write about her war experience. I have here a video clip of the poet herself reciting two of her poems.
Мне уже в начале жизни повезло. На свою не обижаюсь я звезду. В 41-м меня бросило в седло. В 41-м, на 17-м году. Жизнь солдата, ты отчаянный аллюр. Марш-атака, 3-минутный перекур. Как мне в юности когда-то повезло, так и в зрелости по-прежнему везет. Наше чертово святое ремесло распускать поводья снова не дает. Жизнь поэта, ты отчаянный аллюр. Марш-атака, 3-минутный перекур. И, ей-богу, просто некогда стареть. Хоть мелькает полустанками года, допускаю, что меня догонит смерть. Ну, а старость не догонит никогда. Не под силам ей отчаянный аллюр. Марш-атака, 3-минутный перекур.
Бунина.
Доброта. Стираются лица и даты. Но все ж до последнего дня мне помнить о тех, что когда-то хоть чем-то согрели меня. Согрели своей плащ-палаткой, или тихим шутливым словцом, или чаем на столике шатком, или попросту добрым лицом. Как праздник, как счастье, как чудо идет доброта по земле, и я про нее не забуду, хотя забываю о зле.
A close reading of Drunina's poetry reveals a contradictory environment and the complexity of the poet's ideas about gender. While she includes traditional images of mothers and often even represents herself as a nurturing, compassionate woman, she simultaneously portrays herself as an active armed agent, a fighter, and creates a drastically different image than Mother Russia, who arms and then mourns her dead sons, unable to protect herself. She would also express gratitude to her motherland and the war for emancipating her from a traditionally feminine gender role that she deemed restricting. In both her wartime and post-war poetry, Drunina combines traditionally feminine and masculine traits and spaces in unexpected ways and overlaps multiple femininities. Her treatment of gender makes her poetry difficult to define. It is not feminist in a Western sense, as her poetry often supports traditional notions of femininity. Yet she frequently references her strength and defines herself as a fighter. This complexity and refusal to limit her to a narrowly defined, prescribed gender likely contributed to Drunina's instant and continued popularity. She represents women soldiers' views on the front. During the Perestroika era, she was elected to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR in 1990. When asked why she ran for the Supreme Council, Yulia Drunina once answered, "The only thing that prompted me to do this was the desire to protect our army, the interests and rights of participants in the Great Patriotic War and the war in Afghanistan." Disappointed in the usefulness of this activity and realizing that she could not do anything substantial, she left the deputy corps. During the August coup 1991, she was one of the many intellectuals to take part in defending the White House, Russia's parliament building. However, she was terribly depressed later by dissolution of the Soviet Union and publications critical of the Soviet system. She, like many in those days, could not come to terms with what was happening. 3 months later, she committed suicide on November 21, 1991. In a last collection called The Hour of Judgment, she wrote, "The heart is covered with frost. It's very cold at the hour of judgment. And you have eyes like a monk. I have never met such eyes. I'm leaving. I have no strength. Only from afar, all baptized, I'll pray for people like you, for the elect hold Russia over the precipice. But I'm afraid that you are powerless. Therefore, I choose death. How Russia flies downhill, I cannot, I do not want to watch." As per her wish, she was buried next to her husband, Alexei Kaplev, at the Starokrimskaya cemetery in Stary Krim. In eternal memory to her, the Crimean astronomers Nikolai and Lyudmila Chernykh named a distant planet in honor of Yulia Trunina.